The photographer was already setting up his tripod in the corner of the room when my maid of honor walked in and said, "He's not coming," just like that. 4 words. I remember staring at the curling iron still plugged into the wall, the smell of hairspray heavy in the air, my veil sitting on the chair like it was waiting for someone more deserving to wear it. My mother had her back to me. My sister, my maid of honor, Bridget, was standing in the doorway holding her phone like it was evidence at a crime scene. "What do you mean he's not coming?" I said. Not a question. More like I was testing the words to see if they were real. "He texted me." She turned the screen toward me. "He said he needs time. He needs time. On the day of our wedding, with 140 people sitting in white chairs downstairs, with a string quartet playing Pachelbel's Canon on loop, because the ceremony was supposed to start in 47 minutes. I want to tell you I screamed, or cried, or threw something at the wall. But honestly, I just sat back down in the chair in front of the mirror and looked at myself. Full makeup. Hair pinned up with little pearl clips my grandmother gave me. A dress that took 6 months and 3 fittings to get right. And I felt nothing. Just this strange, hollow quiet, like the moment after a car crash before you realize you're hurt. My mother turned around. She took one look at my face and said, "Vivienne." "That's my name, Vivienne." But she only says it that way when something is serious. "Don't make a scene," she said. "That way when something is serious. Don't make a scene," she said. And I almost laughed. Almost. His name was Callum. We'd been together 4 years, engaged for 14 months. I'd met him at a friend's birthday party, the kind where everyone's a little too loud and the music's a little too bad, and he'd handed me a drink and asked what I actually wanted to do with my life in that way, that felt sincere instead of intrusive. I thought he was different. I thought I knew him. The morning of the wedding, I'd woken up at 6:30 feeling genuinely happy. Not nervous. Happy. The kind of settled, certain happiness that I thought meant I'd made the right choice. Bridget said he texted at 7:58. We found out later, much later, that by 7:58 he was already on a plane. Where? His friend's golf trip to Scottsdale. The one he told me was canceled. He didn't even have the decency to call. The ceremony was supposed to start at 2. By 1:15, Bridget and my mother had told the wedding coordinator, a small, efficient woman named Donna, who dealt with the news like someone who had genuinely seen everything. She nodded, made a note on her clipboard, and asked if I wanted her to let the guests know or if I prefer a few more minutes. I said a few more minutes. Those minutes became 20. 20 became 30. I sat in that bridal suite while people I loved sat on folding chairs downstairs wondering what was happening, and I couldn't make myself move. My dad knocked on the door at 1:45. He came in without waiting for an answer, which is very like him, and he sat down on the settee across from me and didn't say anything for a long time. He's not the kind of man who talks to fill silence. That's always been one of my favorite things about him. Finally he said, "You know this isn't about you." "I know," I said. "Doesn't hurt less though." "No." He reached over and squeezed my hand. He was wearing his good cufflinks, the silver ones he only brings out for special occasions, and for some reason that detail broke me a little. He'd gotten dressed up. He'd been ready to walk me down the aisle. We sat there like that for another few minutes. And then there was another knock at the door. I assumed it was Donna, or one of the bridesmaids, or my aunt who tends to appear during family crises with food and opinions. It was my boss. His name is Fletcher. Fletcher Ashby. He's 39, runs the architecture firm where I've worked for almost 3 years, and he is not someone I would have expected to be standing in a hotel corridor in a dark suit looking like he'd walked directly from his car to this door without stopping anywhere. He'd been invited because, this sounds strange but it's true, I liked him. Not in the way you're probably thinking yet, not at that point. I'd worked for him long enough to consider him a real person rather than just my employer. The kind of person who remembered small things and meant what he said and occasionally made me laugh so hard I had to pretend I was coughing. When I made up the guest list, I'd included him without overthinking it. He looked at me and then at my dad and then back at me. "Donna told me," he said. "Donna tells everyone," I said. He almost smiled at that. Not quite. My dad stood up, looked at Fletcher with the specific evaluating expression he reserves for men in my life, and then, and I still think about this, he just patted me on the shoulder and walked out. Closed the door quietly behind him. Fletcher stayed in the doorway. He put his hands in his pockets. I'm not going to tell you it's going to be okay, he said. You're smart enough to know it eventually will be without me saying it. Thank you, I said. I really didn't want to hear that. I know. He came in then. Sat down where my dad had been sitting. And here's where I have to tell you something that's hard to explain unless you've been in a situation like this, where everything around you is in crisis and your own feelings are too big to fit inside your body. Sometimes the most helpful thing another person can do is simply not be alarmed. Fletcher was not alarmed. He was calm in a way that wasn't cold, steady in a way that actually made me feel like the floor was still under my feet. He asked me what I wanted to do, not what I was going to do, not what I was going to do. What I wanted to do. I don't know, I said. Okay. He nodded. What do you not want to do? I don't want to go down there and explain this to 140 people. Okay, he said again. Then, after a moment, what if you didn't have to explain anything? I looked at him. What if, he said slowly, you just went through with it? The reception, the dinner. Let people eat. Let them think whatever they're going to think. You don't owe anyone a scene today. The ceremony already isn't happening. He was quiet for a second, and then he said something that I have turned over in my mind, probably 1,000 times since. What if it did? I need to stop here because I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind when he said that. My first thought was that he'd lost his mind. My second thought was that I'd lost mine. My third thought, the one I've been most reluctant to admit, was that I felt something shift in my chest when he said it. Something that had nothing to do with Callum. Fletcher, I said. You can't just, that's not, I know it's unusual. It's insane. Possibly. He didn't look insane. Possibly. He didn't look insane. He looked like a man who had thought something through. I've known you for 3 years. I know you. Not the way a husband should know a wife. I understand that. But I also know that you are sitting in this room terrified that you're about to become a story people feel sorry for. And you don't deserve to be a story people feel sorry for. Fletcher, just listen. He leaned forward. What I'm suggesting isn't, it wouldn't be real. Obviously, it would be I don't know. A gesture. A way to get through today. And then we figure out the rest. He stopped. Unless you tell me to leave, which I will do. Right now, without question, if that's what you want. I looked at him for a long time. You'd do that, I said. For me. Yes, why? He didn't answer right away. And the way he didn't answer, the careful, deliberate way he found the edge of what he was willing to say, told me more than whatever words he chose. Because you matter to me, he said finally. You've always mattered to me. What happened next is still a little blurry. Donna was involved. Bridget was involved, and her reaction went through approximately 6 emotional phases in about 90 seconds. My dad came back and had a very quiet conversation with Fletcher in the hallway that I wasn't part of, but that apparently ended with my dad shaking Fletcher's hand, which I only know because Bridget told me afterward. There was a moment, I remember this clearly, when Donna was asking Fletcher something logistical and he glanced back at me over his shoulder with this expression that was partly, "Are you sure?" and partly something else I didn't have a name for yet, and I nodded at him and he turned back to Donna. We went downstairs. I don't remember every detail of the next hour. I remember the music. I remember the look on my aunt's face when we came down the aisle. Genuine joy mixed with visible confusion, because she'd heard the whispers. But then here was Vivienne in her dress, with a man who was not Callum, and she didn't know what to think. I remember the officiant who Donna had spoken to quietly and who was a professional enough human being to roll with the adjustment, and who looked at Fletcher and then at me with something like impressed neutrality. I remember Fletcher's hand. How steady it was. He said his part carefully, not robotically, carefully, like every word was one he'd actually considered. When it was my turn, I was shaking slightly and he shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, just enough that his arm was a little closer to mine, like he was making himself a wall against the part of me that wanted to collapse. The officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," and Fletcher looked at me, just looked at me. And in that look was a question that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with something real. I kissed him first. That's the truth. He was about to keep it brief and respectful, and I kissed him in a way that surprised us both. The reception was surreal. There's no other word. People ate the food and drank the wine, and the band played, and my cousins danced, and several well-meaning relatives came to hug me and say things. Like this wasn't the plan, but look how lovely, and I smiled and nodded and got through it. Fletcher stayed close. Not obviously, not in a way that drew attention, but in that particular way of someone who is choosing to be near you. When I needed a moment away from a conversation, he appeared at my shoulder. When someone at table 7 made a slightly too loud comment about the groom situation, he was there saying something pleasant and redirecting before I had to figure out what expression to make. At one point late in the evening, we were standing near the windows looking out at the hotel garden. Fairy lights, still that golden early summer light, and he handed me a glass of water without saying anything, and I thought, I have never noticed how often he does things like that, how often he pays attention. Your dad likes me, he said. My dad is very difficult to read. He told me I had good taste. I looked at him. He said that. He said it in reference to the appetizers, but I think he meant both things. I laughed. Genuinely, for the first time all day, I laughed. 3 weeks later, I was back at work, which was complicated for about 100 reasons, most of which I'd been carefully not thinking about since the wedding. Callum had called twice. I'd let it go to voicemail both times and then deleted the messages without listening to them, which my therapist says is a healthy boundary and which felt more like self-preservation than healing. But I'll take what I can get. The office felt the same as it always had. The good coffee maker in the break room that Fletcher bought because the old one was, in his words, an insult to mornings. The drafting table by the window I always claimed first, the particular late afternoon light that came through the east-facing glass and turned everything briefly golden before it went. I knocked on Fletcher's open office door on a Tuesday afternoon. He was on the phone, but he waved me in, finished the call quickly, and set his phone face down on the desk. You wanted to talk, I said. I always want to talk to you, he said. That's part of the problem. It was the first time either of us had acknowledged that there was a problem, which sounds strange given what had happened 3 weeks earlier, but we'd had this very careful arrangement since then, where we were both being professional and normal, and pretending the wedding had been a logistical favor between colleagues and not whatever it actually was. I sat down in the chair across from his desk. I don't want things to be weird, I said. Things are already weird, Vivian. Weirder than. He was quiet for a moment. Then, can I tell you something? Okay. I knew when you first started here that you were going to be. He stopped. Tried again. There's a kind of person who makes the room function better just by being in it. Not because they're trying to, just because of who they are. You're that kind of person. You've been that kind of person since your first week, and I made a decision then that I was going to be your employer and not anything else, because you deserve to work somewhere. You didn't have to navigate that. I held very still. And then you brought me a wedding invitation, he said. And I told myself I was going to go and be appropriate and wish you well and mean it. He looked at his hands. I did mean it. I wanted you to be happy. Even if, he stopped again. Even if what? I said. He looked up. Even if what I said. He looked up. Even if it wasn't something I could be part of, he said. I wanted you to be happy. And then, that morning happened. And I thought, if I don't say something now, if I let you walk out of this and spend the next year thinking you weren't enough, thinking you were the problem, he shook his head. I couldn't do it, so I did something impulsive and strange and probably inadvisable, and Fletcher. He stopped. Why did you have the rings? I said. He blinked. What? The rings. You had rings. You had rings. You had the ceremony. Donna said you gave them to her. Callum and I had our rings. Mine was with the bridesmaids, but you had. Where did you get rings? A long silence. My mother's, he said quietly. I always keep them in my jacket pocket. She gave them to me when she moved into assisted living and told me not to let them sit in a drawer. I stared at him. Fletcher. I know. You put your mother's rings on my finger? I'm aware of how that sounds. Do you? I had to stop and gather myself. Do you understand what that means to me? He looked at me steadily. I think so. I stood up, walked around the desk. He turned his chair toward me and then stopped, like he was letting me make whatever choice I was about to make. I put my hand against his jaw. You have been paying attention to me for 3 years, I said. Yes. And you didn't say anything. No. That's the most frustrating thing I've ever heard, I said. And also somehow the most, I couldn't finish the sentence. I kissed him instead, properly this time. Not in front of 140 people, not while I was shaking, not while the officiant was watching. Just the two of us in his office with the late afternoon light coming through the east window and the whole strange, unlikely, improbable fact of it. I'm telling you this story now from a place I couldn't have imagined that morning in the bridal suite. I'm telling you because I know some of you understand this particular kind of humiliation. The public kind, the kind that has an audience, the kind where you have to keep your face composed while your whole understanding of your life is rearranging itself. Callum ended up fine, if you're wondering. People like Callum always do. I heard through a mutual friend that he's living in Denver now. I genuinely hope he figures himself out. That's not sarcasm. I hope he becomes the kind of person who can stay. What I know now that I didn't know then, the worst moment of my life, was also the truest one. Sitting in that chair in my wedding dress with the curling iron still plugged in and my sister in the doorway, I was exactly as alone as I felt. And then I wasn't. And the person who stepped into that room, who had been paying attention to me for 3 years while I looked everywhere else, turned out to be the person I'd been circling the whole time without knowing it. Fletcher's mother's rings are still on my finger. We got them properly resized. She cried when we told her the story, which made him pretend to be embarrassed, which is one of my favorite things he does. My dad says he knew from the handshake. My dad always says that. I think he might actually be right this time. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a person was being humiliated in front of everyone they loved. I know better now. The worst thing isn't the humiliation. The worst thing is letting it become the last word. Callum leaving the way he did. No call, no conversation. Just a text to my sister and a seat on a plane. Said everything about who he was that 4 years of being with him, never quite revealed. That's the thing about people. They show you the version they can maintain. What they can't maintain, they eventually run from. He ran. And as awful as that morning was, sitting in that chair in my dress with the curling iron still plugged in, and my whole understanding of my life coming apart, I have to be honest. The version of myself that was about to marry him wasn't the truest version of me either. I'd been making myself smaller in ways I hadn't admitted. Excusing things. Talking myself out of doubts I should have listened to. We were both performing something. He just stopped performing first. Fletcher showing up at that door wasn't luck. It was the result of 3 years of him paying attention while I looked everywhere else. That's what I keep coming back to. Integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the slow accumulation of small choices. Remembering what matters to someone. Showing up when it's inconvenient. Telling the truth even when silence would be easier. Fletcher had been making those choices for 3 years before I ever understood what they meant. I think about the woman in that bridal suite a lot. She was convinced that what had just happened to her defined something about her worth. It didn't. What defined her was what she chose to do in the next hour. She got up. She went downstairs. She didn't hide. That took more courage than anything I'd done before or since, and I didn't even recognize it as courage at the time. I thought I was just surviving the day. But getting up when you have every reason to stay down, that's not just survival. That's the beginning of something. There's a version of this story where I spend the next year convinced I was the problem, where Callum's absence becomes evidence of my inadequacy rather than his character. I almost lived that version. The difference between that version and this one came down to one person who refused to let me disappear into it. That's what I want to say. If you're in a moment that feels like the end of something, the people who walk away are telling you who they are. Let them. Your job isn't to chase that or explain it or fix it. Your job is to stay present enough to notice who stays, who sits down next to you, who asks what you want instead of what you're going to do. Fletcher's mother's rings are on my finger. My dad says he knew from the handshake. I believe him. I think somewhere underneath all that heartbreak and hairspray and chaos, I knew too. I just needed the worst day of my life to finally stop looking in the wrong direction.